All right, it is now 11:02. We have 39 participants online. So Thomas, why don't we go ahead and get started?
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another World Bank Library book discussion. Today's session is particularly striking because it involves one of the great minds of our time, Herman Daily, and Dr. Peter Victor. As you will note from Peter's accent, he's from North London, but he's going to be with us from Ontario, Toronto, actually, where he now lives. I want to give particular thanks to Julia Oblete and the staff at the library for helping to organize this. And I am actually honored and delighted to say a word about Peter Victor. Peter almost was hired by the World Bank because he was invited to a lunch several years ago by Herman Daily when Herman was still alive, and Bob Goodland, who is another environmental economist, and they tried to hire him to work at the World Bank. But he decided no, and he went on to great glory. He's a very prolific author. He has many, many awards. And the title of the book that he's going to discuss today, is Herman Daly's Economics for a Full World, His Life and Ideas. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Peter Victor from Toronto, Canada. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for the introduction, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk with you about Herman Daly. What I'm going to attempt to do is to cover the main points that are in the book. The book's nearly 300 pages, so you'll have to excuse me for being quite brief in many aspects. So what I'm going to go through is some of his early influences. Who influenced Herman? How did he get these ideas that have come to be so significant? I would then want to talk about his view, early developed view, that economics might be better thought of as a life science, more akin to biology and ecology than to physics. Then we'll talk about what I think is his major contribution to economics, which is his analysis and promotion of a steady state economy. The fourth item is the title of one of his most important books, For the Common Good, which was written more recently in 1989 and then 1994. I also want to cover very, very quickly some of the debates he had in the peer-reviewed literature. And then an item I expect many of you will be particularly interested in is a little bit about his experiences at the World Bank. And I'll finish with an account of the influence that he has had and is still having. So, Herman, here he is as a little boy, 4 and at 6. He was born in Houston, Texas. And if you look at the map, you'll see close to Houston is a town called Beaumont, where the family moved to when he was very young and where he really grew up. So he's a Southerner. And by the way, he loved being from the South, and he loved the South. I tried to tempt him up north. He came for a visit once, but that was it. Early influences. I'll start with his mother, Muriel, who took Herman to church, to a Protestant church, on a very regular basis. And Herman remained a devout Christian throughout his life. And it played a role in his economics because he gave more significance to ethics explicitly as an economist than I think you might find among most economists. When he was 8, he was struck down by polio. This was a terrible disease which was largely eradicated through vaccination. But here in this image, you see polio victims. Many of them were children. This is one of the tragedies of polio. It hit the young. And they're in what was called iron lungs that kept them alive by helping them breathe. Although Herman spent many weeks in hospital, he didn't have to go into an iron lung, but he remembers hearing the sounds they made down the corridor. As a teenager, he worked in his father's hardware store, his father Ted, and that was where Herman learnt a lot of practical things. First of all, his father admitted anybody and everybody into the store, and so there was no distinction made according to color, for example. But Herman also learnt the practical side of life, that you needed nuts and bolts to actually make things. When Herman was 15 and working, well, during the time he was working in the store and at high school, he persuaded his father to let him have his left arm amputated because he couldn't bear this withered arm, just was just an encumbrance, which was, again, one of the lessons he learned was that not everything is possible in this world, that there are limits and that we need to respect them and do the best within them. And then I have to mention that he was growing up in Texas when it was segregated, and he never accepted that. It ran contrary to the church teachings that he was learning all the time. And then here he is as an 18-year-old. He went down to Mexico. The trip had a huge influence on him. He saw another country for the first time, a poorer country, and he regretted for the rest of his life catching this beautiful sailfish. So Herman discovers economics. He went to Rice University even before it was called Rice University. I think it was a polytechnic, where he first encountered economics. He thought that it had its feet grounded in the humanities and the sciences. And since he loved both, he thought economics was the subject he wanted to pursue. However, he was soon to discover that it didn't have its feet in either of those subjects. As he described it, its feet were in the air. And one way of understanding his career is that he tried to reground economics in both the humanities and the sciences. He went on to do his PhD at Vanderbilt University. His supervisor for much of that time was Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, who had a huge influence on his thinking. His first academic position was in the Department of Economics at Louisiana State University. There he is in 1964, where he eventually got his PhD. It took a while, but during that time he did publish 5 papers, so he was very well qualified by the time he became an assistant professor. Now, I mentioned in the introduction, economics as a life science. This is the title of a paper he published in 1968, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it. And this diagram comes directly from the paper. It's his representation of biological systems which take in matter and energy, use that in all respects to support life, but the output is degraded matter and degraded energy. Herman realized that you could describe an economy in pretty much the same way. So this is the second part of his diagram, and it shows again matter and energy entering the economy through production and then consumption, and ultimately resulting in matter and energy. So this was a perspective of his that stayed with him his entire life and is really the core perspective of ecological economics to this day. In 1973, he produced this book called Toward a Steady State Economy. It's actually a collection of papers. He wrote a wonderful introduction, quite lengthy, and another paper in this collection. And there were papers by all sorts of eminent writers of the day whose names you would recognize with menu, I hope. We'll take a look at the book for yourselves. This is a diagram that appears in the book. And you'll see it's really an elaboration of what I showed you a moment ago. You have the total environment or ecosystem, the outside box, with the sun coming in. Essentially, all that comes into the Earth from outer space is solar energy. And then within that, you have the economy represented in a rather unusual way, with matter and energy entering, the new becoming old, resulting in waste matter and waste energy going out back into the environment. There is some recycling of matter, no recycling of energy, but there is some recycling of matter. Now, this image he's drawn and redrawn many times over the years, but that's the fundamental perspective that he developed all those years ago. He reminds us that the flow of materials is covered by the conservation law, which says the quantity of materials and energy in any process is conserved, so it's materials and energy. But with respect to energy in particular, the capacity of energy to do work declines with use. So the first conservation law is about quantity, the entropy law is about quality. And the fact that the capacity of energy to do work after it's been used once always declines is of fundamental importance to understanding an economy today, just as it was then. What is a steady state economy? Well, in 1973, Herman defined it as an economy with constant population and constant stock of capital, which have to be maintained, as he said, by a low rate of throughput, that's throughput of energy and materials, that is within the regenerative and assimilative capacities of the ecosystem. So in his first understanding of a steady state economy, it was population and the stock of capital that were to be held constant. Many years later, this is in 2008, he twisted it around. He said that a steady state economy can be defined as a constant flow of throughput at a sustainable low level, with population and capital stock free to adjust to whatever size can be maintained by the constant throughput that begins with depletion and ends with pollution. So in the first one, it's the throughput that's held constant, it's the stocks that are held constant with throughput varying. And in the second definition, it's the throughput that's held constant with the stocks of capital and population allowed to vary. The next critical, I think, contribution he made later on in 1992, though he'd been thinking about it a bit before then, was that we need policies not just for allocation efficiency, which is emphasized so much in mainstream economics, of the functioning of the market, but he said we need policies for the scale of the economy, scale being measured in physical terms, so that the physical size of the economy should be decided upon in relation to the capacity of the ecosystem that contains it to sustain it. He said we also need policies for distribution, which is the apportionment of income and wealth among different people. And then, because he saw a logical connection here, a logical hierarchy, and then economics and economic policy can devote its attention to allocation and whether markets or other institutions are appropriate depending upon what the goods and services are that need to be allocated. Finally, from this seminal book in 1993, we have his ends mean spectrum. In this diagram shows political economy, which is the old name for economics, focusing mostly on what he called intermediate means and how they can be used to produce intermediate ends. But he said that the intermediate means come from the ultimate means, which is the low entropy matter energy that governs all economic activity that can unfortunately get ignored too much. That's really the domain of the physical sciences. And at the upper end, he said these intermediate ends are very important, but we need to look beyond that and think about the ultimate end. What is the purpose of life? What is the purpose of our own lives? What is the purpose of our lives collectively? And this is where ethics comes in. And so this was his map of knowledge, which proves, I think, very useful, particularly to students trying to understand where economics fits within the larger framework of human knowledge and understanding. Then in 1989, followed by a second edition in 1994, we see For the Common Good, a book that he co-authored with theologian John Cobb Jr. You'll notice the subtitle there, Redirecting the Economy Toward Community, the Environment, and a Sustainable Future. A very broad book in its scope, highly recommended. I'm just going to pick out one item of particular interest, I think, to the World Bank, and I think you've done some work in this area yourselves, but this was the forerunner. This was his Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare. He's been a long-term critic of GDP as a measure of well-being or welfare, and the attempt here was to come up with something also measured in monetary units, but much more closely related to welfare, and therefore more useful for judging how well an economy is doing. And in its simplest terms, it starts from the normal measures of personal consumption in dollar terms, adds public non-defensive expenditures. They don't include things like expenditures on the police, which are there, which can increase when crime goes up. So they have this whole category, because he worked with colleagues on these defensive expenditures, and he subtracts from GDP the private defensive expenditures, extra locks that you might put on your door because you're unsafe. Add in capital formation, add in the services from domestic labor, which is not included in GDP, subtract the costs of environmental degradation and the depreciation of natural capital. Now, when you do that, as they did in the book nearly 30 years ago, this shows from 1951 to 1990 that GMP, similar to GDP, increased by nearly 2% a year over that time period, whereas the index of sustainable economic welfare rose less than 0.5% on average over that period. Now, when you break it down by decades, as he did, you see that that pattern was sustained throughout that period, the GDP rising much faster than the index of sustainable economic welfare. But in 80 to 90, this was when they diverged very much, because the index showed a decline in well-being in the United States. And Herman, who had a very good way of coming up with neat terms, described this as uneconomic growth, where the economic growth is such that the costs of the growth are outweighing the benefits. And in the US, where this data was applied, the situation was getting worse. Just briefly, Herman loved to debate. He always wanted people to challenge and question his ideas. If there were problems or he was incorrect, please, he would say, correct him. So here is a list of the debates that you can find in the literature. With his mentor and professor on the steady state economy, whether it could last forever or not. I think that was a false debate. Daly never said it would last forever, and Georgescu-Roegen misunderstood him. Daly debated the relevance of thermodynamics to economics, the conservation laws, the entropy law, and so on. I think he won that one. There was a sort of a debate with Bhagwati on free trade in the Scientific American, but they were like ships passing in the night. Daly talked about how free trade was based on the idea of comparative advantage, and comparative advantage was based upon there being free fixed capital immobility. It didn't flow between trading nations. But Bhagwati took up other points. It was a very fruitless debate, I think. There was this debate about whether you do need, in fact, a policy objective for every instrument. I think Daly was on good grounds there, based his ideas on Tinbergen's view of that, who'd won the Nobel Prize for it. He debated with his friend and colleague Sagoff, who was a philosopher, on ethics, knowledge, and whether knowledge could replace resources and capital. They were good friends, but they never came to an agreement on those issues. He also debated with famous economists Solow and Stiglitz separately on economic growth. They were invited to write commentaries on his views. They wrote about 1.5 pages each. It was a perfunctory treatment, and they never really took on seriously the view of production that he'd acquired from Georgescu-Roegen. Again, basing the theory of production in ways that are consistent with the laws of physics. And finally, he had a much more fruitful debate with Kenneth Arrow. The pluses there indicate that they were parts of groups who were debating these things, but they were the leaders of the groups. And there, the answer to the question of are we consuming too much was very interesting because of the differences. Arrow focused more on whether there was too much consumption and too little investment in the economy, and Daly focused much more on the size of the economy was too large in relation to the containing biosphere. Well, in 1988, Herman Daly joined the World Bank. When he did, the science writer Constant Holdren had the following to say: The most unorthodox addition to the World Bank's environmental manpower is economist Herman Daily. Although hell will probably have to freeze over, or the bank adopted the heretical biologically based theory of economics promoted by Daly, many of the practical implications of his ideas are in tune with some of the new directions. Well, I thought that was a very good comment, I think Daly, as far as I have learned from the research that I did, had quite an impact on the World Bank while he was there. But he only lasted 6 years. Oops. No, I've got an episode to tell you about. He was asked in 1992, this is a photograph of Herman, much later than that, of course, to comment on the report that the World Bank was writing on development and the environment. And I'm going to let you hear for yourself what he had to say.
Okay, so here comes the first draft of the report, lands on my desk. So I eagerly read it. And early on in the report, there's a diagram, the caption of which is the relation of the economy to the environment. And there was a picture, and it was a rectangle labeled economy, and an arrow coming in from the left labeled inputs, and an arrow exiting to the right labeled outputs. That was it. No discussion, what is this? Well, I said, okay, here's an opening. They're trying to draw a diagram of the relation of the economy to the environment. And at the bank, you have to be, as all bureaucracy, you try to be polite. So I didn't say this is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. This is a good beginning. We've got the economy here, and we've got inputs and outputs, but where's the environment? We don't know where the inputs are coming from. We don't know where they came from. We don't know where the outputs are going. We don't know anything about the relationship between the inputs and the outputs. Why don't we draw a larger circle around this rectangle and label that environment or ecosystem or ecosphere or something like that? Then we would be showing that the economy is a subsystem of the larger biophysical ecosystem. Then it would be clear that the inputs were being extracted from the environment. It would be clear that the outputs, waste, are being expelled back to the environment. We could then talk about the relationship between the inputs and the outputs. They're connected. The concept of a throughput, of an entropic metabolic flow of resources from depletion through production to consumption and to waste. And then we could talk about recycling. We could talk about recycling through the ecosystem by biodegradability. We could talk about internal recycling within the economy of materials. We could then talk about the impossibility of recycling energy. So how do we economize energy to affect the recycling? We could talk about all of these things. We could ask the question of which end of the input is more restrictive, the input in depletion or pollution, and does that change over time? How so? And indeed, we could ask the question, how big is the subsystem economy relative to the total system? That's kind of an interesting question. How big is it? How much of the total does it take up? What are the different ways of measuring that? How big can it be? Is there some maximum beyond which it all collapses? How big should it be? Is there some optimum which is good from the point of view of human beings or all living things or so forth? And we could ask all of these questions, and that would really be a nice thing to do for the World Bank.
So here is the diagram that he was commenting on in the first edition, or the first draft, I should say, of the World Development Report in 1992. When he and he submitted the kind of comments that he's just spoken to us about on this diagram. This is the version that appeared in the second draft. No discussion, by the way, no discussion in the text. But this diagram, he thought that was more of a picture frame than a representation of the containing ecosystem. When the third draft came, nothing. No diagram, no discussion. It was gone. It was too much to take in, apparently, at the time. Well, when Herman left the World Bank, he gave a speech in which he gave advice to the bank, both in terms of its internal operations and its external operations. These are the four key points that he made. That the bank should stop counting the consumption of natural capital as income, that labor should be taxed, labor and income should be taxed less, and resources and throughput should be taxed more. Maximize the productivity of natural capital in the short run and invest in increasing its supply in the long run. And the fourth one, which he considered to be the least likely of his recommendations to be accepted, but all of a sudden has a certain currency these days, move away from the ideology of global economic integration by free trade, free capital mobility, and export-led growth, and toward a more nationalist orientation that seeks to develop domestic production for internal markets as the first option, having recourse to international trade only when clearly much more efficient. Well, I've said quite a lot, as he did, about the metabolism of economies. Just to give you an indication of the influence he has had, here is the sort of diagram that was produced by European academics showing the material throughput of the global economy in 1900. And this is a Sankey diagram, which means that the width of the lines in the diagram represent the magnitude that's being represented by the line. So you can see that materials have been classified into three: fossil materials, biomass, metals, and minerals. And that in 1900, an estimated 7.3, I believe, million tons were extracted and from the containing biosphere, and the diagram shows the flow through of these materials, and you see on the right hand side emissions and solid and liquid waste outputs and water vapor. So now going close nearer in time to 1945, you can see it's the same diagram, but the lines have got thicker, representing the increase in the flow through of materials and energy, including fossil materials. That's a source of energy, but you can think of them as materials initially when they come into the economy. And then in 1973, you see what's happening here. The global economy is increasing its requirements of materials and energy from the biosphere and increasing the emissions and production of waste on the far right-hand side. Here's 2002, here's 2015, and that's the latest I've been able to get hold of. But I'm pretty sure this increase has gone on since then. Another version of his diagram, which comes from his textbook with Josh Farley, is this notion that we've gone from an empty world where the economy, they're located inside the globe, was small in relation to it, where the width of these two lines linking the circle to welfare shows that when in his terms we had an empty world, most of human well-being came directly from the ecosystem and less in proportion from the economy. This has turned around now. You can see that most of the welfare is coming from the economy and much less from the ecosystem, which has been depleted by the expanding economy. Another point relating to that, which I just want to make, and then I'll move on. Mainstream economics is often the assumption that you can substitute what nature provides with what humans can build. Herman thought that was a mistake, by and large, that nature and human capital are really complements, not substitutes. So there you see the a graphic of an empty world with one fishing boat and loads of fish. And here you see loads of fishing boats and very few fish. And you don't catch many fish if the fish aren't there to be caught. And that's symptomatic of the full world. Another way of looking at Daly's influence is I've got here 8 boxes, each one representing a, if you like, school of thought or a collection of people with a common shared interest, looking for ways to think about and move us towards a post-growth world. So at the top, you have the steady state economy of Herman's, which I think has influenced all of the others. And I think the people involved in them will say so too. You have the circular economy, the regenerative economy, the well-being economy, buen vivir, which is a global south version, if you like, of the well-being economy. And I've put that there because we've got a lot to learn from the global south and how to run our economy better and be happier people. The donut economy you've probably heard of, which is about meeting the sustainable development goals within planetary boundaries. The degrowth movement, which again is very much related to the steady state economy, because it also emphasizes the physical size of an economy, and arguing that it should be reduced. Well, reduced not forever, presumably, but reduced to some sort of steady state, as Herman proposed. And then we have the eco-socialism, which goes beyond what can be done in capitalism, saying we have to change the whole economic system to have a proper post-growth world. In 2014, Herman received the Blue Planet Prize, and I'm going to read the citation. It says, Professor Herman Daily redefines steady-state economics through the concept of sustainability by incorporating such factors as the environment, local communities, quality of life, and ethics into economic theory, which led to building a foundation of ecological economics. He has been questioning whether economic growth brings happiness to humans and has been issuing warnings to society, which tends to overemphasize economic growth. As a consequence, he has had a significant intellectual influence. So here's a photograph of myself and Herman in 2018 when I spent a week interviewing him for the biography. It was a very memorable week for me, a high point in my life, I would have to say. And I don't know what he was thinking about me when this photo was taken, but I was thinking that he's a gentleman, well-liked and widely admired. He's an original thinker, an excellent writer, and he'll debate with anyone, and his ideas are more relevant today than ever. And with that, I thank you for your attention and look forward to hearing questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, do you want me to say anything? Thank you very much. That was excellent. One question I had is whether Herman was ever interested in what Thorsten Veblen did with the theory of the leisure class. Do you know in your research whether that book had any impact on him?
It's not one that I think he went out of his way to emphasize, but I've no doubt that he read it. He was a voracious reader and avid reader, I think I should say. But anyway, Thorsten Veblen's ideas that you have the idea of conspicuous consumption, which is a term that he introduced, that,
yes.
that people buy simply to appear better than somebody else, is perfectly consistent with Herman's views that people generally satisfy their most urgent needs first, and subsequently the less and less important ones. And at that point where they're buying in order to just impress other people, he would give very little weight to that and saying, what kind of damage is that kind of consumption doing to the biosphere? And
yes.
we should back off from that.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to open it up now to questions and comments. Please keep them as briefly as you can, because there are many people online. I would simply ask you, as you ask your questions, to just tell us where you're calling in from. Julia, are we ready to go here?
Yes.
How many people online?
It's been varying, but right now there are 42.
42? Okay. Well, let's go then.
Nicholas Menzies, could you please unmute yourself and ask your question? Nicholas Menzies.
Thanks a lot. I'm Nick Menzies. I'm in the Environment Department at the bank. Thanks a lot, Peter, for your presentation. I was interested to see that diagram you had where you'd shown the way that Herman had influenced all these other thinkings or these other areas of thought. But working in the bank, I tend to feel like his ideas haven't permeated very deeply, if at all. And this may be an unfair question to you, someone outside of the World Bank, but I'm just wondering, do you have a view on perhaps why his views weren't so influential inside the institution?
Fading out.
And I suppose whether Herman himself ever expressed, maybe he had a different view, maybe he thought he was influential, and maybe he had a view on why he wasn't. And I ask that because there's a group of us in the bank who are seeking to take on his legacy, and it's important, I think, to try and understand perhaps why the institution today has been a little bit resistant. Thanks.
Thanks for the question, Nick. Well, we did talk about that somewhat. I've got to say that Herman, although he didn't think he had been particularly influential while he was there, I mean, he was involved in project assessment, so and that was an important role too. But in terms of changing the sort of the main lines of thinking of the bank and the main policy, he didn't think he'd accomplished a great deal. However, he never had a bad word to say about the bank, other than to say that he felt that it wasn't behaving in a way that was true to its origins, which was to help internationalism flourish on the planet, to improve the relationships among nations. He felt that the World Bank had adopted a globalist perspective and was quite happy to see all sorts of barriers to trade broken down, based fallaciously, he would argue, on the theory of comparative advantage. But he did, however, having said that, he did think the bank was slowly moving in directions that he supported. I do believe you've done work on greening GDP, which is very similar to the index of sustainable economic well-being. I think there have been efforts in the World Bank to estimate the value of natural capital. By the way, Herman was more inclined than I am personally to use the term natural capital to describe nature, but he was quite clear that he didn't think the monetization of natural capital was the way to go. But nonetheless, he felt it was a step in the right direction to be paying some attention to that. I think you have an uphill battle, frankly, in terms of getting these ideas adopted. It's something that requires a longer discussion than we can have now. But I think it goes back to the way most economists are still trained, particularly in this part of the world, North America, to think about what an economy is, what it's for, or maybe not to think about those things. But when Herman and I were reminiscing, because he was only a few years older than me, that both he and I took courses on history of economic thought, on economic history, on comparative economic systems. These are all considered normal parts of the training of an economist, but they seem to have been pushed out with an overemphasis on technique, on econometrics and mathematics. But so if students are not being trained in a way that opens their eyes and their minds to Herman's ideas, it's very difficult when they then get hired for the things they've learned to have a change in heart, change in mind, working in such an organization as you do.
Okay, Nick, go ahead.
So we have a question from the chat from Rob Smith that says, "Hi, Peter. Given the UN Secretary General's call for countries to move beyond GDP as the central measure of progress, what are your thoughts about the World Bank's work on extended wealth accounting, which incorporates much of Herman's thinking about the importance of natural capital, but extends it to all forms of capital?"
Thank you.
Yes. Well, for those of you who don't know Rob used to be the director of environmental statistics for Statistics Canada, and we know each other very well. Well, I've already mentioned that Herman thought that paying attention to natural capital in any way was better than ignoring it, but he didn't really favor just doing that by valuing it in monetary terms, adding up a total with human-made capital in monetary terms, and then making some conclusion about whether, well, if total capital has risen, we're okay. If it's in decline, then there's a problem. Because natural capital he saw as a complement to human capital, not as a substitute. And if once you've added them together, they're automatically assumed to be substitutes unless you've done something rather unusual. Look, Herman was supportive of everybody's efforts to pay more attention to the environment, and he was not dogmatic. He wouldn't come out and say that's the wrong way to do it, you're wasting your time, or anything like that. So what can I say? He was supportive. He didn't think it was going far enough. It wasn't paying enough attention to the biophysical underpinnings of the economy and to the ethical umbrella in which it operates. And I don't think the measures that you've mentioned address either of those really. So it was okay, but he was not going to be outside the World Bank with a sign saying thank you for adopting all my ideas.
Okay, go ahead. Yep.
Thank you so much for that answer. Okay, we're going to move on to someone who has raised their hand. And again, we ask you to please keep your questions brief. So, Mr. Delbert Fitchett, would you please unmute yourself?
Thank you. I hope that you're hearing me.
Yes,
I knew Bob and also Herman. They joined Bank off a short time after I did. And whenever I saw Bob, I would always tell him, well, you know, Bob, I'm a resource economist too, because, you know, I used to work for Resources for the Future. And Bob would always grin and say, oh, you mean resources for the near future. And you understand, of course, what he's referring to, the technique of discounting future benefits and costs and doing your economic analysis. And I always enjoyed that little with Bob Goodwin. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad you've mentioned him because he was an ecologist, of course. Although he was Herman's boss, he brought an ecologist view to understanding nature. And so the idea of discounting, it just didn't resonate with him. He just thought, and I think I've never heard that resources for the near future before, but I think it's very appropriate because, of course, discounting does discount the future. That's what it's designed for.
Go ahead.
We have one more question as well in the chat that says, hi, Peter, was Herman an optimist?
Yes, if I have to answer that yes or no, he was an optimist because he was religious. He believed in the main creed. He described himself, by the way, as a general purpose Protestant, because I asked him what Protestant church he subscribed to, and he said, I'm a general purpose Protestant. So in other words, he accepted the basic teachings of Christianity, and that inevitably led him to an ultimately optimistic view. But when it got to discussions about specific issues and specific developments going on in the world, he was, he wasn't brimming with optimism. He was not a technological optimist, for example. He thought that was a very poor way to think of things, that technology will always find a way through and solve whatever problems we have, and whether he just thought the evidence for that was very hard to find. But even then he had a pragmatic view. He said, look, if the technological optimists believe that resource scarcity is a non-issue because technology will always find a way around such a scarcity. He said, well, then why would they object to us increasing the prices of resources in order to conserve them? Because if they're right, well, the downside's not so bad, but if they're wrong, it's chaos. And plus the fact that if you impose a limit on resource use on an economy, and a limit on throughput, that will increase the prices of those resources. That will encourage the development of the very technologies that the technological optimists believe in. So you see, Herman would not just dismiss technological optimism as a poor framework within which to understand our predicament, but he would have a creative idea about how to think, how to induce the technological changes that these people expect. Well, he says we can't just expect them to happen on their own. We can induce them perhaps to some extent with proper policies.
Thank you so much, Dr. Victor. We have one last question that's actually is going to be done verbally, but it's also in the chat. So Philip Grinstead, could you kindly unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much, Peter, for taking the time and the excellent talk. Actually, my question is not related to what I wrote in the chat, but I was curious about in what way you think that Herman Daly's thinking has evolved and changed over time. And I'm thinking like both kind of like intellectually, kind of like things that he would see differently after thinking about it for longer, and also like how, you know, the world has gotten fuller and fuller, and how that may have like changed his thinking, and both intellectually, but also in terms of what he thinks leverage points would be to create change.
Give me a signal when you want.
Like whether he got more, for example, radical and saying, you know, we can't just publish academic papers, but we need to, you know, be in the streets and fight for kind of like those ecological models to be recognized. Like, do you see like any changes happening intellectually and on political side?
Well, that's a question I should have a clear answer to. You know, he wrote an article that was published in the New York Times in 1970, I believe, 70 or 72. Anyway, it wasn't later than 72. It was called "The Canary Has Fallen." And what he was doing was using the analogy of the canary in a mine, which drops dead and warns the miners that the air is poisonous. And he's saying the canary has fallen, and he's talking about the world as it was then, around 1970. And that article, which you can find online, is a very good summary of his thinking at that time. And I say this because it's very similar to his thinking decades later. What he has done during that time was to elaborate his ideas, write about them in many different places, to help found the International Society for Ecological Economics and the journal Ecological Economics that they produce. He was, as I say, one of the founders. And I think it's fair to say, others may not agree, but I think it was his ideas primarily which provided the foundation for that society. So to that extent, he was stepping outside of, well, some might say the normal bounds of academia, but probably not too much. He left the World Bank. He left the academia to go to the World Bank, partly because he felt so unwelcome, not only in his Department of Economics, but in the sort of the departments of economics across the US. And so that was an escape valve for him from which he learned a lot. But I have to say, and trying to answer your question, I don't think he changed his outlook very much at all over that 50 years. And I'm so struck by the number of times he would mention me. He said, I was always wanting people to tell me where I was wrong. What's wrong with my analysis? What's wrong with my perspective? Where am I mistaken? And those who took up the challenge did not persuade him that he was wrong in any more than a few details. Now, with respect to these elements of a movement, if you like, he was very positive about this. He was very pleased to see these different groups forming, communicating with one another, and there are many more than the few that I put on that diagram. And I remember a very interesting online conversation between him and Kate Rayworth, the founder of Donut Economics and the Donut Economics Labs that are now being established in many parts of the world, to get communities to think as best they can about what they can do at the community level that will help their community help us all meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's the donut. It was to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. That's the inside of the donut. The outside is the planetary boundaries. Comes from another stream of literature. So, and he said in this interview how she had definitely taken his ideas forward beyond his beyond what he has done, because she was being practical. She was getting out there, talking to people, involving them, developing community action, and so on. He hadn't done much of that himself, so he's left that for the rest of us to do.
Good.
Thank you for that answer. There are two more questions in the chat. One says, it's clear Herman was impacted by his travels to a poorer country early on. He also was around during decolonization movements in the global south prior to structural adjustments and other actions that suppressed these movements. What was Daily's perspective on development, and did it change throughout his life?
Thank you. Herman did an interesting thing. He made a sharp distinction between growth and development. He said growth is about quantity, development is about quality. And he said that you can have development without growth. I'm going to come back to your question specifically in a moment, but just to finish this point, because it relates a bit back to what Rob Smith was asking about. One of his main arguments against GDP was that it conflates the two. You can't tell whether when GDP goes up, whether it's because there's more development, qualitative improvement that's happened, or whether there's more, it's a quantitative change. So I think that's important, because I do think it's a very useful distinction to make. It may not be unproblematic, but it is a useful distinction. So when you ask what were his views on development, if you're asking that in the more traditional way, should poorer countries have economic growth, Herman would say yes, that's clearly the priority for them. But the rich countries are much less so. And if it's true, we've entered an era. If it's true, we've entered an era of uneconomic, where the growth is making people worse off, then clearly it's development we want and not growth to solve that problem. He was very sympathetic to the global south. He married a Brazilian woman. He was married had a Brazilian wife. He spoke Portuguese. He taught in Brazil. So his view of the global south was primarily derived from his lived experience in Brazil. And he wrote some interesting papers early on about population growth and what should be done to curtail that in a humane way and so on. So he did engage in discussion, and he wrote about development, as you've raised in your question, but he would never claim expertise in the area.
Julie,
that
I want to say something, and then I'll say that. Ready? Peter, I'd like to just make an observation here before the last two questions. Herman actually was at the bank at a very, very interesting time, a transitional period. The president of the bank at the time was Barbara Conable, if I have my dates correctly. And Barbara was a former United States congressman who was very interested in the environment and forests. And his wife was very, very significant, influential on his thinking about forests and how the bank could help save forests. And it also happened that during this period, this was a time of great protest against the bank by non-governmental organizations all over the world because of its involvement in India's infamous Narmada Dam project. I was personally involved in that, and it got so bad that Conable actually called the Prime Minister of India and asked him, please disinvite us from this bloody project. It's going to destroy Ida. And he did, and we got out. And Herman was there in the middle of this, and that period led to a major change in the way the bank did business, particularly involving a greater concern for the environmental impact of growth on these societies. I think we have two more questions, and then we'll bring it to a close.
That's correct, Thomas. Thank you very much. Dr. Victor, we have two more questions, but we also have a very small comment to you from Benjamin Lujano. He says, best wishes from Mexico. So there's a greeting for you. Another question from Suzanne Carter. She says, do you see progress in Dr. Daly's ideas making it into conventional economics classrooms? Is Dr. Victor still with us?
Sorry, I lost the connection. I'm back on now. I heard the question. Nice for Ben to say hello from Mexico. I'm not in a very good position to say what's happening in Department of Economics now, partly because I retired from teaching back in 2017, but I wasn't even teaching in the economics department at that point. I was in a faculty of environmental studies, which was interdisciplinary and far more open to Herman's ideas. So I would get most of my information about what students are being taught from students who would come to that faculty because they wanted a broader appreciation of economics. So I certainly have the distinct impression that the conventional training is still, or the mainstream training is still very narrow and doesn't pay attention to Herman. Now, that's not to say that his ideas are not being taught outside of Department of Economics to economic students, but they're typically students who are looking for a broader conception of an economy than they're being given in their training. So it's a very slow process, way too slow, given the situation we're in. And I'm sorry I don't have better news for you than that.
And the last question is, steady state was a reasonable response back in the 1970s. But since then, human metabolism has increased so much that we need to find ways to run economies to serve people while also reducing our resource dependence. My apologies. An even tougher challenge. How did Herman Daily see this additional challenge?
Well, I think that he would say that it was easier to think of achieving a steady state given the physical size of the economy, especially if you're talking about the US or Canada, that there was still time to reach a steady state that would be fairly close to what the biosphere could support. But now the size of these economies in physical terms is a couple of times more than it was then, roughly speaking. So the task is much harder. But to take your point, if it's true we have to reduce our requirements of materials and energy, then Herman would say, yes, that's true. Reduce them down to a steady state that can be sustained. It's just that the steady state now is harder to achieve than it was. But the objective hasn't changed. And he would also say that we'll reach a steady state anyway. It's just a question of how. Nature won't allow a continual expansion of human pressure on the biosphere without it coming back and hitting us. And we're already seeing obvious signs of that through climate change and biodiversity loss, which is going to and the increase in pandemics and all of these things that are well described in the literature and national, international statistics and on the web. And Herman was not happy about that direction, I think, any more than any of us on this call would be.
Thank you very much, Peter, for an excellent presentation. It was great. And thanks to everyone for participating. Peter's book on Herman is available on Amazon and anywhere else you can buy books these days. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you soon in the near future.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Victor. We appreciate it. On behalf of the WBG Library, we thank you, and we also thank Thomas for moderating for us, and all of you who attended. Please come again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.